Sorry, Doug, the Ontario Court of Appeal has just ruled that the federal carbon tax is constitutional. Here's why that matters and what it means going forward. Hey everybody, thanks again for stopping by. If you've been following the news recently, you know that the carbon tax has been a major point of contention between conservative premiers across many provinces and the federal government, with Justin Trudeau's Liberals trying to impose a federal carbon tax on those provinces that aren't willing to implement their own, and provinces like Ontario and New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, among others, trying to oppose that ruling by declaring a federal carbon tax unconstitutional. But the appeals court in Saskatchewan ruled against Scott Moe's Saskatchewan party government, and here in Ontario, the Ontario Court of Appeals has ruled against Doug Ford's PCs, even more resoundingly than in Saskatchewan, arguing that the federal government has the constitutional ability to implement environmental policy that is national in scope, that crosses the provinces in scope, arguing that the ability to address environmental issues cannot be isolated province by province or city by city. Now, this doesn't mean that provinces and cities can't implement their own environmental policies and have different environmental policies, but that the federal government needs to have the power, if it so chooses, to implement national strategies relating to the environment and to the climate. That was pretty clear in my view all along, that the federal government had the right to do this. Again, whether or not you agree with that, that's the constitutional rule of law. It sort of goes to the pipeline for me, the pipeline to ship, tar sand oil to the BC coast. I was opposed to that pipeline. I still am. But I do realize that under the rules of the game, things like pipelines and things like international trade are clearly federal in jurisdiction, and provinces have limited ability to resist those policies, even if they disagree with them, even if they have environmental and safety concerns, because the federal government has a lot of constitutional power and the ability to dictate trade that crosses provinces and that crosses international boundaries, and things like pipelines and sort of infrastructure that crosses provincial borders, like, say, a Trans-Canada highway, is clearly federal in its jurisdiction. So that's where we're at here. This was a open and shut case in my view. And while the Supreme Court will hear Saskatchewan's appeal, I don't think it'll go any different. I think that appeal will reconfirm what we've heard from the Saskatchewan Appeal Court and from the Ontario Appeal Court, which is that regardless of whether you think a carbon tax will work or not, or you think it's the best choice, or you think it's good or bad, the federal government has the prerogative to implement a carbon tax on a federal level. Simple as that. Preservation of the environment and addressing things like climate change cannot be done if one or two or more provinces opts out. It needs a solidaristic effort, and that's that. It's like the provinces can't decide that the Trans-Canada won't go through their borders. Provinces can't decide against, saying, the military having bases in a particular province. And those things are federal in concern, and so is the environment. So, I'm not a Liberal supporter, of course. I'm a New Democrat, and I have a lot of issues with the way the Liberals implemented their carbon tax. I think it allows big polluters to get away with polluting. I think a carbon tax should be part of a climate plan, but a real climate plan has to be based in economic planning and government ownership and really building a Green New Deal in a more systematic fashion. But the reality here is that the carbon tax is constitutional. And this actually does bode well, I feel, for broader Green New Deal policies. Because those Green New Deal policies will, at some cases, run up against conservative and right-leaning Liberals at the provincial level who will try to resist, say, a Green New Deal plan implemented by Jagmeet Singh. And now there is at least partial precedence to suggest that the federal government has the ability to expand powers when it comes to the protection of the environment, and maybe Green New Deal policies will play a role in that. So that's where we are. This is not going to be too long of a video. I just wanted to outline that I expected this decision all along. The Supreme Court has still not made, the ultimate ruling here, but I'd be very, very, very surprised to see the Supreme Court go against, a 4-1 ruling at the Ontario level and even a split ruling in Saskatchewan. And I think that by the end of the year, by December, we'll know that a federal carbon tax is constitutional. Now, none of this guarantees a carbon tax. If Andrew Scheer becomes Prime Minister and wants to scrap the tax, that's perfectly legal. And then, individual provinces might have a carbon tax, but then Andrew Scheer can go to those provinces and say, look, I'm not going to impose one on you. That's how you can fight a carbon tax. You have to do it through political means because it's constitutional in the terms of division of powers between federal governments and provincial governments. But above all, I think this is really a big defeat for Doug Ford and this idea that he's looking out for Ontarians. Because Doug Ford and his experts, they darn well knew the carbon tax was constitutional. They knew it. There's no doubt in my mind that they knew that. And they did all of this so that they could rile up their base and they could send out donation letters and requests and that they could get members signed up and get people riled up against the, Justin Trudeau and his job-killing carbon tax and just really stoke that fire and getting the taxpayer of Ontario to pay for it. Because Doug Ford didn't pay for this legal challenge. Doug Ford's government didn't pay for it through, their individual funds for how they operate the government. Doug Ford's political party didn't pay for it, nor did Scott Moe's political party pay for it in Saskatchewan. It was paid for by the Ontario taxpayers. All of us paid for it. Even though we didn't want that challenge. A majority of Ontarians didn't want that challenge. And so Doug Ford used our taxpayer dollars for a partisan abuse of the courts. Knowing that this was constitutional and knowing that he had to do this so that he could say, I've challenged Justin Trudeau's job-killing carbon tax, and now the only alternative is for you to vote for Andrew Scheer and stop this carbon tax madness. It's duplicitous, it's wasteful, and it shows that when it comes to conservatives, they actually don't care all that much about respecting the taxpayer dollar when it comes to promoting their own interests and their own values ahead of what the majority of the province actually believes. So everybody, thanks again for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would appreciate it if you liked, comment, and subscribed. Doing so helps to spread the message, to let people know that Doug Ford's carbon tax failure here wasn't just a result of honorable legal minds differing. It was a cynical effort to challenge a law that is at a common sense level constitutional and doing so for partisan political purposes. It needs to be called out for the transparent waste and cynicism that it engendered. And if you can, I would appreciate your support on Patreon. Supporting me there helps to build a progressive space on YouTube for Canadian politics commentators. It's a space that's very small and that I feel needs to grow, and your support on Patreon will help me expand this channel and also help me to work with others as we build a progressive ecosystem for Canadian politics here on YouTube. So guys, have a great one. Have a happy Canada Day weekend, and I'll see you soon.